Hi, everyone. I'm Rabbi David Ingber, and this is Detours and Destinations from the 92nd Street Y. Conversations with deep thinkers about their journeys, both expected and unexpected, and the wisdom gleaned from the twists and turns along their path. Today's guest is my colleague and friend, Rabbi Dianne Cohler-Esses. Rabbi Dianne is a rabbi at the Romemu congregation in New York and is the director of lifelong learning there. She is a much sought-after educator throughout the Jewish world and an amazing human being. It is such a privilege and an honor to welcome you to Detours and Destinations, Rabbi Dianne.
I'm thrilled to be here, David, and to be your conversational partner here.
So just some ground rules before we start. We're just going to call each other, as we always do in all conversation. I'm David, you're Dianne. And I guess the first question for you, Dianne, as we begin this, what we both agree is a much needed deepening of conversation more broadly. We're beginning that here between the two of us, but we both agree that what's severely lacking and sorely needed in our communities are just human-to-human conversations and listening. I just want to start with a question that animated this podcast's inception, and it's the ideas we had around it, which is the whole idea of detours and destinations, right? That the only way we know that something is a detour because we believe that there's a destination, right? Do you believe that there are destinations, as it were, or is it certainly we might feel that we had a destination to which there were many detours, but how do you understand that whole quagmire of like a detour versus a destination, and how does
that's really
how does that
interesting.
speak to you?
So my life is so full of detours, and I think much of my life I've been yearning for a destination because destination represents some relief from the detour or from the struggle, for the challenge, from the this isn't quite right. I need to get to this place. I need to get to X or Y or Z. And I realized, I think actually even recently, that's it. There are no destinations. There's no moment when you arrive. Unless it's every moment in which you arrive. So I don't think there's a destination unless we think about it in a whole different way, which is every moment is an arrival. And every moment is a destination, is a coming home. And every moment is a detour. Every moment is a disruption. And every moment is a restoration.
It feels very aligned with something that our friend, our colleague, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer once said about the Jewish people writ large, which is that we have kind of trouble with arrivals. We're the ever departing people, right? The minute we get somewhere, there's a kind of restlessness that one can see as neurotic, that the sense of departure that one never fully arrives. But you can also frame it differently, which is we are a people that is ever aware of the danger of arrival. Arrival then becomes complacency. Arrival then becomes final destination, the sense that there's nothing left to do. So I think that's the way that Yehuda was framing it, and the way that I'm listening to you framing it is that there's a shift that you had and that one can have, which is that there can be a quote, kind of a soft destination. You're sort of going towards.
You graduate rabbinical school.
I want to go to rabbinical school.
I graduated.
And then along the way, right, you became right.
But that didn't solve or settle anything.
Right. That destinations and detours are sliding terms that feel intuitively and subjectively true. You can be disappointed. You have to be super enlightened, I don't know, some holy person to feel like, oh, my kid got sick, and that's, not a detour from their life. And yet there is a way of softening around some of our rigid assumptions about, but I was supposed to be there by 3:00, and I was supposed to be there and not here. So there's something, that helps us see those terms a little bit more in more complicated ways, which is
I also think there's something about Jewish history. It's not only neurotic, but there's a tragic element to it. There's a paradigm destruction, right? There's, October 7th was a destruction of a paradigm, right? We thought we were safe. We thought somehow we were going forward in a certain way, and that was shattered.
Right.
In the span of a day, shattered. Right? There's so many moments of shattering. It's not neurotic. It's like Jewish history.
Right. And what I love about what you're saying is that the original, for me at least, the original detour destination conversation, how one turns detours into destinations or how one sees them as destinations, is also part of the rabbinic inheritance that we are both, and all of us are privy to, or we are the recipients of, which is, right, whenever there was a tragedy or a paradigm shift, the rabbis eventually were able to reframe it, or they saw it as their job to reframe it. The destruction of the temple was
their work.
Right, their work.
Right, the whole legacy came from destruction.
Right. So they turned, right, tragedy into some version of part of the travel, right? That was part of what it means to be contingent to and vulnerable to all that life brings, is that you have the power to reframe.
And here we are in the wake of another destruction. And what's our approach to that? I was just teaching about the Omer and counting the Omer, and what this period of time between Passover and Shavuot. And what's so beautiful about that is that it's a time filled with yearning, but it's also a time filled with activity and agency. This is day 1 of my yearning. This is day 2 of my yearning. It's like, how do you shape your yearning so that you don't feel at the mercy of all of life's detours? It's almost like claiming the detour, owning the detour, reappropriating it.
I love that. Owning our detours is incredible. And like the notion that one would own a detour, and somehow ownership of a detour means that you also are equipped now with a skill, like a pair of glasses that you're able to put on to turn a detour into a destination. And that's a profoundly important skill. And I want to talk more about that, at least, through your life. But before we talk about detours, destinations, and all of the current realities that we just introduced, I'd like to actually move from now to the past and have a conversation with you a little bit about your really interesting and fascinating story. I mean, you're known as the first Syrian-Jewish rabbi. It's your first Syrian-Jewish woman to become a rabbi. And that was maybe not a destination, but a place that you arrived at. And I'd love to have our listeners know a little bit about what brought you to that point.
Well, that certainly was not in the script.
Yeah.
I was born in South America, in Bogota, Colombia, and my family moved to New York when I was pretty young, and I grew up in the traditional community of Syrian Jews in Brooklyn. So the script there, especially for a girl, is getting married at 18, and ideally not really working outside the house, working inside the house, having a big family, moving around the corner from your parents. And it's not a script I wanted. It's not a script that worked for me in terms of fitting into the Syrian community, even as a young person, even as a sort of budding adolescent. I didn't quite fit. So I started to dream of something else.
And when did that dreaming begin? So as an adolescent?
So I may have mentioned this to you. I'm not sure. I actually even mentioned it in a sermon. But when I was in high school, I could not imagine women becoming rabbis. Like, that was not a possibility. Rabbi meant men. But I was reading about nuns one day in the New York Times Magazine, and I was fascinated. I decided I wanted to be a nun. I didn't tell anybody. But there's something about the religious life and a lifelong spiritual pursuit and quest and devoting one's life to that, which really appealed to me.
Wow.
So I didn't really carry that very far. But I did.
You mean you didn't just come out and say to your family, your traditional family in Colombia, I've been fantasizing about becoming a nun?
No, I didn't mention that. But when I went to college, I studied philosophy and religion. This is after rejecting Judaism completely. I felt like Judaism held nothing for me. And then I started studying things like existentialism, atheism, and then Jewish philosophers that I had never been exposed to growing up in modern Orthodox yeshiva, like Martin Buber, Abraham Isaac Cook. I was like, whoa, this is Judaism? This is really powerful stuff. This is really meaningful. And, going to Yeshiva Flatbush, Judaism felt very kind of boring, not spiritual, not something like, oh, this is a life path in which I can search for meaning and connection and a relationship with God. So those ideas sort of emerged in college.
Those are ideas that emerged in college.
Yeah.
But just to backtrack slightly, just for our listeners.
Yeah.
So the yeshiva of Flatbush that you referenced.
Yeah.
So you grew up in a intensely traditional Syrian community.
Yeah.
And the flavor of Judaism that you practiced was called modern Orthodoxy, for those who are not familiar, or some version of Orthodoxy, which is deeply traditional and yet somewhat accommodating of an American.
Well, let me make it more nuanced
Yeah,
already.
great.
So Syrian Jews, because they don't hail from Europe, didn't come through like the denominational prism. So they're not Orthodox, they're not conservative, they're not Reformed, they're not renewal. But if you go to one of their synagogues, you go, oh, they're Orthodox.
Right.
But they don't have denominations. So my father worked on Saturday after he went to synagogue. But he went to the same synagogue as everyone else.
I got it.
So when someone says to me, oh, you grew up Orthodox, I'm like, I grew up very traditional. They said, you mean Orthodox? I'm like, I don't exactly mean Orthodox.
The denominational matrix that you just described, just for listeners who might not be familiar with Judaism at all, Judaism until, let's say, the 19th century or so was not called Orthodox. Orthodox was a word that was borrowed from Christianity. Judaism, there was one flavor in the Baskin-Robbins of Judaism. There was like one thing called Judaism. And it happened to be what we would call now traditional Judaism, Orthodoxy. And then with the reform movement's rise in Germany and in Europe, and the conservative movement, which of course is only conservative relevant to the reform. Reform is as far away from Orthodoxy as you could get, and conservative Judaism tried to split the difference between them. And then there are other quote unquote flavors of Judaism. Some of them are called Reconstructionism, which is a distinctly American phenomenon, renewal, more spiritual, more meditative, and that kind of thing, is kind of like there are a lot of different denominations. And so what you're saying, Diane, is that the Syrian Jewish community really wasn't exposed to those various flavors. There was kind of one style of Judaism, and it was called what we do. And what we did...
It's called being an SY,
being an
short
SY,
for Syrian Jew.
Being a Syrian Jew. And if you were to then walk into a Syrian service or a Syrian community or a Syrian congregation or a synagogue, if you were to try to understand it through the prism, through the labels of denominations, you would say, oh, this looks like an Orthodox service, what I know of as an Orthodox service. But for those who were on the inside of it, like you and your family, it was like, no, this is just the way we do things. And it can even include going to work after services, which is distinctly not Orthodox. It's kind of a
right. My father was not
hybrid.
Alone in that and going to work after synagogue. And I would say not only looking at it through a denominational prism, but looking at it through an Ashkenazic prism, you would say Orthodox. Like you grew up as a non-Orthodox Jew,
Yes.
as far as I understand.
Very much.
Right.
Yeah. But we walked
But I
past the
grew up as a
conservative-
Syrian Jew.
Right.
And we called ourselves SYs, and we called you guys JDubs. Like you were...
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. JDubs for JW, meaning Jewish. So we were Syrian Jews, and everyone else
I never
were
heard
like
that.
generic Jewish. And you were, in our eyes, definitely second-class citizens.
Oh, I want to come back. This is so juicy. I want to come back to it.
Yeah.
So being a JDub, now I have a whole new identity. I'm going to say proud JDub. But in your universe, like as a young woman, a young kid, it wasn't, being a rabbi wasn't on this. It wasn't even on the radar. It would never have arisen. But what did arise for you was an exposure to women in a different religion who were dedicated to God, and that calling or that sense that, oh, I'm someone who wants to be dedicated to God. Not only was it not possible for you to become a rabbi because it didn't arise for you, but the kind of Jewish content that you were being exposed to didn't feed your soul either.
Exactly.
And so when you went to university and it was almost like you discovered that the part of you that wanted meaning and purpose and connection to God, which you weren't even sure if Judaism had that kind of content, let alone a role for you.
Exactly. Could Judaism be spiritual?
Right.
Could Judaism lead to meaning?
And
the answer in college that I got was yes.
Yes. And that awakened something in you.
Yeah.
But it came with a price, because in the traditional Jewish world that you had grown up in, there was really no analogous role to the nun, or in the quote unquote, what we JDubs would call the Orthodox world, or what SYs call the traditional world. There was no way for you to take this newfound love for Buber and, Abraham Isaac Kook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine, or Levinas, or any of these great philosophers. There's no way for you to say, oh, I want to dedicate myself to that, unless you went outside.
Right, but by that time I'd already left the community, because leaving home to go to college is already breaking all the rules.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was supposed to go to Brooklyn College and stay home until I got married. So it was a very traditional community, not because it was Orthodox, given, conversation we just had, but in terms of gender roles and sons going into their father's businesses and being incredibly cohesive. Like the whole community en masse, not the whole community, but went to like the Jersey Shore for the summer. So the community just moved and had their whole social life on the Jersey Shore, from Brooklyn to the Jersey Shore. And when they got to New York City in the first quarter of the last century, they moved to the Lower East Side. Then they moved to Bensonhurst. Then they moved to Flatbush. They were like flocks of birds.
Very tribal and very
totally
insular.
It's a tribe. It's an absolute tribe.
A tribe within a tribe. Within a Judaism that sees itself as a tribe in the world.
Most American Jews I know don't function like tribes.
Right, not in quite this way.
The Syrian Jews function like a tribe.
Wow. So on every level here, you're choosing a path for yourself that is not consistent with what everybody else is doing.
Correct, by becoming a rabbi. But I was already doing that.
Right, before you became a rabbi.
Yeah.
And we're not even up to that yet, but we do know that you have broken some of the unwritten rules about what it is to be a woman in that culture and in that tribe.
Right.
And I'm so curious, so what was because I want to talk about your parents and where you come from, because how did your parents respond to your desire to go to college and not just do what everybody else is expected of them?
Well, disappointment.
They were disappointed in you.
Yeah. I mean, they ended up supporting me through college.
But you knew they were disappointed with you.
They were disappointed. That's not what they wanted from me. They wanted me to marry a Syrian Jew very early on in life. By the time I got married in my mid-30s, they had given up on me marrying a Syrian Jew, just wanted me to marry a Jew.
So your family is disappointed in you, but something in you knew that you had a different destination for yourself and that you were being led in a different way, and you had something in you that you didn't silence. You didn't just say, okay, you know what, I'll follow along. I'll just do what's expected.
I couldn't.
You couldn't.
I didn't experience it as a decision. I did not fit in the community. When I was young in high school, I'd go back and forth between the Syrians and the Ashkenazim, because Flatbush had both. It was about 50-50. But there was something about being in the Syrian Jewish world that just didn't feel right. And people experienced me as not that. I was different. It was inevitable that I had to leave.
So this inevitability that you had to leave, I think I remember us speaking about a bit in your family history at some point, and you had revealed to me a remarkable thing about how your family came to be in Colombia to begin with, in Bogota. Can you share that a little bit about your remarkable grandmother?
Yeah. It's interesting because I was thinking about my grandmother. I was thinking my very beginnings started off as Detour, or at least certainly my mother's beginnings, which are also my beginnings. So my grandma was born in Syria, got married in Egypt, went to Manchester with her husband. They had one child, one daughter. And her husband was, as far as I know, I don't know the details, was fooling around or really being sort of not a good husband in many ways.
That's the story in the family, that he wasn't a good
deadbeat,
husband.
Right?
Deadbeat, okay.
So she has one toddler and is pregnant with my mother and divorces her husband. I mean, this is 1934. What woman does that? This is unbelievable.
It is
What
unbelievable.
Syrian woman does that, right? Then she moves to Haiti because she has a sister there. She moves to Haiti.
She moves to Haiti from Manchester, alone, a single mother.
Alone.
With two children.
Yeah, to live with her sister, and finds the only eligible bachelor in all of Haiti, Jewish bachelor, marries him, and has 3 more kids. And then when my mother's oldest sister, my aunt, and my mother was sort of, getting to be 15, 17, they moved to Colombia because there weren't enough Jews for them to marry in Haiti. There were 10 families there, 10 Jewish families. So they moved to Colombia, and I still have some family in Colombia. So I have a big Latin extended family.
So you have a big Latin extended family, but all of this...
On my mother's side.
Talk about detours and destinations. I mean, the mapping of these geographic choices is also a mapping of very profound, courageous choices to step out of things and to know when to step out.
To step out and protect one's family and ensure the survival of one's family and the flourishing of one's family.
So this is the matriarchal power in your family. A powerful grandmother who is protective of her children and protective of her own self-dignity. I mean, her own dignity is like she has. Right, she didn't silence
just
herself.
Stay married. Yes.
She didn't stay married.
Right.
She said, you know what, this is not okay, and she divorces it. And we weren't there. We don't know like her diary entries, but this becomes part of what you are born into. This is part of your inheritance. Is that there is a dignity to remain true to oneself, even if it looks like a detour outside. It's really a destination, right? Your whole life. You know, someone might have been looking and going like, wait a second, let me get this straight. You're leaving Manchester to go to Port-au-Prince, right? Or
Port-au-Prince,
right?
Yeah.
And to Haiti. And then to know then in Haiti that it was time to go to Bogota.
Exactly.
It's just remarkable to me.
Yeah, and I think about that a lot now because there's so many reasons now to leave this country. And we personally, like my family, 2 children with disabilities out of the 3, and we're worried about Medicaid, and we think about leaving. But who wants to leave your life?
Right.
You know, I think you don't really understand what it means to leave a country and to immigrate until you think about that and what it could mean for your family personally. You know, now I feel like I understand why so many Jews didn't leave Europe.
Didn't leave Europe.
Yeah.
I can't wait to talk about that because that's also a remarkable part of your journey and your wisdom and your teaching. But when you're growing up in this community and you're an only child, you're growing up and you have a longing that is awakened by reading about nuns.
Well, the longing actually
predates.
So I went to Jewish sleepaway camp. So I started off with Mossad, which I think you went to.
I also went to Mossad.
Seneca Lake, which I think
not
you went
Mossad, by the way, listeners. Not Mossad. It's not a camp for prospective spies. It was called Mossad, and it was a deeply Zionistic camp. It spoke Hebrew and
Hebrew
so on,
speaking,
my father went to Mossad.
Nice. So Mossad, Seneca Lake, also Kfar Masada, which was more liberal but also Zionist. And camp is really where my Jewish spirituality was born. And I came back home after camp. I started when I was 11, and my home didn't have that kind of spirituality, and neither did the yeshiva I went to. And I was yearning for something.
Yeah, like a God.
I had a God,
itch, and nobody was scratching
God it. And just community and holiness. And I recognized that when I read about the nuns. But I ended up after camp being so disappointed with Yeshiva Flatbush and my parents' lack of observance, which is ironic because it was such a traditional community, that I totally rejected Judaism for years.
Because it felt hypocritical to you, or it felt...
No, because there was not the spiritual sustenance I was looking for, just simply wasn't there. And then I think I was angry.
But you experienced it in camp, though.
I did.
But you couldn't...
But I couldn't find it anywhere else.
Recreate it. There was nowhere...
Yes, right. Couldn't recreate it.
What was your prayer life like when you were at those moments, like before you left Judaism? But did you talk to God? Did you?
Yeah, there were definitely conversations
with God
as a child, for sure.
Can I eavesdrop on one of them for a second? What would you be asking God to help you with, or?
And it was help. Maybe at moments there was asking for help, but I remember more standing in awe of the natural world, even in Brooklyn. Like
a tree grows in Brooklyn.
Trees, the trees. The trees outside like my house and our neighborhood, like grand. And I'd feel that sense of spirituality, but felt kind of alone in that. I also remember going to some kind of Hasidic shtibel.
It's like a small Hasidic synagogue that's usually like housed in a brownstone or some such thing. Yeah.
My friend who was a European Jew, her father brought us there on Simchas Torah. And the fervor.
Like her friend brought you there at the end of the holiday of what is known as Sukkot, in the harvest festival in fall. And the last day of that holiday
the joy of the Torah.
The rejoicing of the Torah, because Jews traditionally finish reading the whole Torah, the annual reading of the Torah on that day, and then they rejoice with the Torahs by dancing.
And the dancing was remarkable. And I was young enough, I was probably around 9 maybe, to be able to be with the men dancing. And I just remember that spiritual moment. So there were moments where I felt that spiritual sustenance, either in Judaism or outside of Judaism, but mostly in my worlds, my home life, my yeshiva life, I could not find it. So I gave up on it.
I'm just so curious about this. Was it, because I haven't heard something I haven't heard, but I'm just curious about it. Is it also that it was the domain of the men, or did you just think Judaism didn't have it, or my traditional schooling doesn't have it, or my parents don't have it? But if I were a man,
No,
you didn't think, if I was,
no, I
Right.
did not think that.
Okay.
It's not like I wanted what was on the other side of the mechitza. So I was so disappointed and so rebellious that there was one Yom Kippur that I met my friend in a restaurant and we ate treif. We went out and ate unkosher food on Yom Kippur.
By the way, we're gonna edit that out because we're gonna have the censors. It's not a confessional. No, we're not. That's pretty. That's a profoundly intense statement of disillusionment and maybe even resentment and anger and rebellion, which obviously is rooted in something holy though, because your disappointment, like you had a sense of the divine, you had a sense of the holy, you had a sense of what we know in Judaism as kedusha or holiness or the sacred, but you just you weren't being nourished by your own tradition.
Didn't feel accessible to me.
So with all of this, we can now better understand like that you listened to your own desire to go to college, and notwithstanding that your parents wanted you not to go to college.
But by that time, I didn't even identify as Jewish
anymore. You were rebellious.
Like I was an atheist, I was a Marxist. I didn't really know what Marxist meant.
But then it all awakened by being exposed to Jewish philosophy and by recognizing that there were things in the tradition that would nourish you. And then what happened? What did you do with that?
So I was studying then with a non-Jewish professor. A professor who wasn't Jewish, teaching things like atheism, theism, and existentialism, and reading Martin Buber. Like all this with a professor who became my mentor, who was a great spiritual teacher for me. And I started becoming interested in Judaism all over again. And after college, I started going to a modern Orthodox synagogue in Brooklyn with Meir Fund.
With Rabbi
Meir Fund, who's a mystical bent, in an Orthodox synagogue. Ultimately, I felt as a woman that it was not working for me. Like the separation between men and women. There was a lot of apologetics around women's role in Judaism that didn't sit well with me. And I emerged from there to join egalitarian synagogues on the Upper West Side of Manhattan where men and women had more equal roles. But it was in Brooklyn through a chavurah where I met a rabbinical student named Rabbi Susan Grossman. I was like, wow, women could become rabbis.
So Rabbi Susan Grossman was the first exposure you had.
Yeah.
Really, to someone who
and I was
who could be a rabbi.
Enchanted
by that.
Fascinated. So that gave me the idea. And I worked for 5 years between college and rabbinical school, doing all kinds of things, including I studied public history. I worked on Syrian-Jewish history in the Sephardic Community Center. I worked on the history of civil rights in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Historical Society. I worked with homeless Jews. And I was at a crossroads at a certain point. Like, do I want to work in folklore or public history, or do I want to become a rabbi? And I decided to become a rabbi because it felt like it integrated a spiritual search, intellectual pursuits, and community work all in one, which is exactly what I wanted. And oral history is all about listening to other people's stories, and I wanted to be part of the Jewish conversation, more personally as opposed to as an academic.
And at that point, living your own life, not, having not gone down the path that was expected of you, did the burgeoning notion that you were going to be doing something that in your community is just not even a starter, did that weigh in on you? Were you afraid? Did you?
Oh, yes. I was very afraid. I didn't tell my parents for months after I got into rabbinical school.
That you were, right.
And in fact, I wrote a piece about it called Boiled in Oil.
Boiled in Oil.
Because one rabbi, may his memory be blessed, he's no longer alive, he was a wonderful rabbi in the community, one of the more liberal rabbis. I said, well, what will happen when the community finds out I'm becoming a rabbi? He goes, you'll be boiled in oil.
You'll be boiled in oil? And he said it with a straight face?
Yes. And he tried to encourage me to become a social worker.
Right, rabbi, social worker, rabbi, social worker. Not exactly the same thing.
Exactly. And then I finally told my parents. And I remember we were sitting in a Jewish restaurant on West 72nd Street called the Famous Dairy Restaurant that Isaac Bashevis Singer used to go to, famous Yiddish writer. And I remember there was this couple next to us on a shidduch date, like on an arranged date. I was like, oh, if only I could sort of have a scripted life. I wanted that scripted life. But in fact, what I had was the opposite. I was about to tell my parents that I wasn't living according to the script. And I told my parents, and my mother was silent for a long time. And my father said, well, why don't you get married and have a man put you through school?
Why don't you get married and have a man pay for school?
Yes, put you through school. I said, well, I don't need a man to put me through school. I went basically on scholarships. And then my mother finally said, like, I just can't imagine it. Like, I can imagine my daughter, their teacher, my daughter, a social worker, but I cannot imagine saying my daughter, the rabbi. And in fact, for years, she just told her friends she's studying. Like they never told their friends.
They never told their friends you became a rabbi.
No. They found out, their friends, because the whole community found out.
Yeah, of course.
But they never told their friends. It was a source of shame for them.
It was a source of shame.
Yeah.
Does it hurt when you think about that still?
I feel sad for them.
Yeah.
I feel actually sad for them that they, had to feel that sense of inadequacy in their own social circles.
I just want to say, how poignant it is to me to hear you describe the scene that I think a lot of us who are listening can immediately drop into. Like in a restaurant, you're sitting there and you look over, and in your own inner reverie, you see the scripted moment and you have almost a longing to be able to be a person who could live that kind of scripted life, just so that you could avoid the pain that's about to, this painful conversation. And as you said it, I thought to myself, it's true that you're not living their script, but there are multiple scripts here, because in some ways you are no different than your grandmother's remarkable adherence and her listening and attuning herself to what she needed to do, even if the whole world. And it reminds me of this teaching that we both know as rabbis, that in the rabbinic tradition, the word used to describe Abraham, the first Jew or the first Israelite, is Ivri, somebody who was a Hebrew. We don't really know what the word means. Ivri doesn't, it's not really clear. We say Hebrew, but that's just a phoneticized way of saying Ivri. But the rabbis playfully read that word as Ivri from the word la'avor, which means the one who goes over. And it says, Kol ha'olam kulo b'tzad hazeh, the whole world is on one side, and Abraham b'tzad hasheni, that Abraham was willing to stand against the whole world if it was the right thing. And in some ways, like that moment with your parents, you were like saying, I have a script. It's called Abraham's script, or Sarah's script, or Rebecca's script. Like the whole world can be doing one thing, but I am listening, like my grandmother before me, right, to what I need to do in my life. But like that's not the frame that they could see, and that is sad. It is sad that they couldn't see that.
I mean, I think the issue that's coming up for me as we have this conversation is the issue of belonging. I was looking over with some jealousy at that couple because they never had to threaten belonging to their family or their community. And even my grandmother, right? She left her husband, but somehow that didn't, as far as I know, threaten her relationship with her family.
And
so
did this ultimately?
Oh, totally. But leaving home, to start with, threatened my sense of belonging. And I don't belong to the community, for sure. And I don't belong to my extended family. I mean, I do and I don't. I'm a little bit of an outsider.
When you went back into the Syrian community, did people discuss? They said, "Hey, is it true? We heard that you went to."
They don't bring it up.
They don't even bring it up.
They don't usually bring it. I remember once a friend saying before I got married, saying, "When are you going to get married already?" But basically, they don't bring it up. They don't address it directly. But it's the big unsaid shame thing.
So let me ask you, when you describe yourself in your bio, or as we began this conversation, we said you are the first Syrian woman to become a rabbi. How do you wear that?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
What, did you want to specify?
No, I just think listening to the ambivalence that I can't, like in some sense, your destination, and I'm curious about this, your destination, if you followed your heart, was already known to you on some level, it seems, from your earliest connection with the divine, with meaning and your intellectual gifts, and you have a voracious mind, you're very curious, and it was so clear that in some way, almost like, I hate to be Pollyannish, but like Yentl, like there's a certain, you belong.
That's what my relatives call me.
Do they call you Yentl?
Yes.
From the movie Yentl with Barbra Streisand. Like you are, in a way, there's a kind of spiritual dysmorphia, like you don't belong. And your destination will involve what others will perceive as detours, tremendously big detours. Like here you are in New York, is only on a detour to getting married, right? Which is, she'll come home, she'll just go back,
Right.
And so I guess my question, just to finish that thread, would be, and yet you are a Syrian Jew, you're an SY, you live in a JDub world.
Totally JDub.
Totally JDub world, but you are an SY. And when you say, I'm the first Syrian Jewish woman, are you making a claim on that in a way as like, this is something to be proud of in spite of what, my community might say, I'm proud of being a Syrian Jewish woman, I'm proud of being a pioneer. I don't know. How do you think about that?
So, well, let me just tell a little story about that first. So when I first graduated rabbinical school, lots of people wanted me to come and speak about becoming the first Syrian Jewish woman rabbi. And after like a year or two, I remember like walking down the street with my husband and doing like a little like song and dance, like, oh, I'm the first Syrian. Like I got sick of it. It became my narrative and my song and my script. And somehow it didn't feel like it really told the story of who I really was. It felt a little bit external. So I do use it as saying like, oh, I come from that traditional community. I left it. It's not a way of claiming pride in the Syrian Jewish community. And I am proud about a lot of things. I am proud of the community. I think they have powerful countercultural values, which I can't share in, but just the way their interconnectedness, their wovenness, the way they honor their elders. They don't just put their elders in like old age homes. I mean, they honor their elders.
There's an intergenerational
closeness and transmission. I mean, it's live. Yeah. It's palpable. In the food, in the music, in the prayer. And, an Ashkenazi like you, a JDub like you, would walk into a Syrian synagogue like, oh my God, it sounds like a mosque. What's going on here? It's a totally different thing. Yeah. But the traditions are thick and they're passed down from generation to generation, which is not true of much of American Judaism. I mean, it's amazing. So I do stand in awe of that. But that's not my claim when I say I'm the first rabbi. I'm the first woman to become a rabbi from the Syrian Jewish community. That's my claim of being a pioneer.
It's more definitional of your psychospiritual makeup, that you are the kind of person, we heard this, like as soon as something becomes too scripted, it's not for you. Like it's too scripted. And you stand slightly outside of that in a way, which is a challenge to belonging anyway. Any one of us who finds ourselves, wouldn't want to be a part of a club that would have them and that kind of thing.
Right.
But speaking of unscripted though, like you mentioned as you're walking down the street with your husband, that also didn't follow a script that you might have imagined when you were a young woman in terms of when you would find your husband and what it would look like, and then the uniqueness of the challenges and the beauty of your family and some of the detours in motherhood that kind of you also then had to contend with. So do you mind sharing some of that with the...
So 2 of my 3 kids have significant disabilities. My son is profoundly autistic and my elder daughter has developmental disabilities. So that is not what I was expecting as a mother. I just thought my kids would be neurotypical, In the community that I was then, which as a synagogue I still attend occasionally when I'm off from Romemu, Anshe Chesed Min Yamat, like the trajectory was you go to a good Jewish school like Heschel, and you go to an excellent college, and that's...
So it took you a long time to finally find the right person, and you met your husband.
Right.
And...
Didn't get married till I was almost 36.
And in that...
I had my first child at 38, and then 2 more at 41.
So in your world, that's completely... In the world that you had come from, it's completely unheard of.
All my friends were grandparents by the time I became my mother. The women I grew up with were grandparents by the time I became old.
Wow.
It's like I skipped a generation.
I just need to take that in for a second. You know, I mean, I also got married relatively late in the
Yes.
JDub world, and
Yes.
I have
Well,
high school
for your
friends,
world, for
right,
your
from the
world,
world
yeah.
that I was in, and in my universe now, like I have high school friends, a couple of high school friends who have
grandchildren.
But in your world, it was completely unheard of. And like many of us, you thought, okay, that's the hard part, which is finding your partner, finding your, the lover, creating a family. Now comes like the beautiful part, like, we've worked on ourselves, or we spent a lot of time finding ourselves, and then you get married, and
Right. I finally hit some normalcy.
right,
Especially according to my parents. Like, they were so happy at my wedding, and then having children, they were so happy. And for me, normalcy was like, I've also craved normalcy.
sure,
Like the relief of normalcy. And there was a basis upon which my parents could accept me being married and having kids. And then suddenly the whole script was disrupted all over again.
in a way that even as someone who doesn't like scripts, you probably...
It's not the way I wanted my script to be disrupted. Yeah. It took me a long time to say, this is my family.
Your son Ellie, who has autism, was until the age of 5.
6.5.
6.5.
He was speaking. He had certain disabilities, but he was very verbal and lost his ability to speak at 6.5. So that was a huge blow for the whole family. Yeah.
And how did you, obviously your husband too, but as a woman of faith, as someone who saw trees in Brooklyn and felt the immense, majesty, even within a dense urban setting, you could find pockets of meaning and pockets of transcendence. How did your faith and your own connection support you during this radical detour in motherhood? Like motherhood, right, detoured. What helped you survive? What helped you make it through the day-to-day that must have been so overwhelming? Or also your career was taking off and you were teaching and you were in the public eye and community.
Well, in the beginning, nothing helped me. I was pretty depressed, to be honest. It's a good question. I think what helps me is a deep understanding that there are no guarantees, and that life as it is, even if it's filled with loss, is the place through which God is speaking. Like, even if it's not what you want, there's something about it that needs to be listened to. It reminds me, so one of my kids, the neurotypical one, was very, very ill with a brain tumor, and she's fine now. But I remember people saying to me, oh, you're going to get your life back after chemo. I mean, it was an ordeal and a nightmare. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to get my life back. This is my life. And people would say the same thing during the pandemic. When are we going to get our lives back? Like, normal life is such a privileged expectation. So I think that's what I've learned. That this is all life, right? The nightmare, I don't know about the dream, but the nightmare and the normalcy. And the moments that are dreams and that are gifts in that way. But the whole package is what God's speaking through.
The whole package is what God is speaking through.
The whole package.
The light and the dark. God creates light.
The grief and the suffering and the joy and the just day-to-day normalcy.
That spiritual perspective is almost like a mantra or like a reminder constantly that life is happening. It's not life will start or life will come back, but this is what is present.
This is it. No matter what it is, this is it.
This is it. And how do I step into it and be more present for it?
Exactly. Which comes through radical acceptance without giving up agency.
Right. That's a big sentence.
Yeah.
Right? Radical acceptance without giving up agency. The simple version of that is that you are both in the present moment and not resisting it, even as you, are not surrendering your ability to make change, but it's kind of like accepting it and also being able to act on it all at once.
Yes, exactly. Like when my daughter was ill, it came through the recognition of how ill she was, that lit a fire under me to save her life. And not that that was completely up to me, obviously, but I did everything I could. But if you don't get the reality, then you can't even begin to fight because you're in denial of what it is.
Wow, we could go on I could go 3 hours with you on this topic, like this idea I don't know if it's in Zen, I read it as in Zen, but the paradox of change is that nothing changes until it becomes what it already is, right? As long as it isn't yet what it is, you're denying it, or you don't want to see it, you don't want to look at it, you're resisting its truth. It's like it can't possibly become something new or change because you're not present with it fully.
Right. It's like Jacob's wrestling with the angel. And finally, after having lied about his identity to his father and saying, I am Esau, he finally says, I am Jacob. And that's when his name changes, right? After he claims his identity. But I'm curious, I don't know if you want to go here, but I know you also struggle with, your kids' issues, which are different than my kids' issues.
Yeah, totally.
I'm wondering what, if anything, helps you.
Well, what you said really speaks to me. I think I wouldn't be honest if I didn't admit that there are times where, to use your image, I look over at the booth and see the arranged date and think to myself, my whole life has been so much of my personal life and is about following, my own journey or detours that I didn't think this was going to happen, and then it was a detour, and some of them are detours that I intended, which kind of is interesting, but like my own twists and turns in my life. And when I finally got married, I thought, oh, here's the scripted part a little bit better.
Right.
Like I've arrived.
Right. Exactly. Here's the scripted part. Right.
The divine cookie crumbs that led me back to Goldilocks.
Found the beautiful Jewish woman.
Exactly. I found my partner, and we're going to build a family and a synagogue. But in our family system, just like you alluded to, has been extremely complicated. And there were things that nobody prepared me for, and I wasn't prepared for. And this has been my greatest spiritual practice, has been being a parent, and a parent to these 3 boys, and the various struggles that my wife and I have gone through. And one of the biggest teachings for us, of course, is it's really impossible to know what's going on in anybody's home, no matter what, the Facebook pictures look like, and no matter what your yearbook picture looks like or the resume looks like. And that's one of the silver linings, or as my friend called them, the silver learnings of the COVID pandemic, was like a lot of the artifice around people, various things were removed, and we had glimpses into people's homes. I know that soon also became artifice, but there was a sense of a collective humility around what people have to put up with in their lives and how they have to manage various detours. And it's very humbling when that happens, and you have to find new ways forward, and you have to find ways of being in the world. And so I've been very humbled by my own journey with my kids, and it's led me and my wife on a journey towards really being the best parents that we can be to these kids. And that also opened up, a universe of teachings about parenting styles. So I really appreciate the question, but I feel as though the phrase that really popped out to me that you used earlier was that when we get our life back, someone said to you, when are you going to get your life back? And I think that, you said during the COVID pandemic, that was a sense too, like, when do we go back to normal? And I think in a different way, but not altogether dissimilar, since October 7th in the Jewish world, and since more recent events here domestically, there is yet another moment of thinking about when does life go back to normal, and when does life go back to certain predictable patterns and scripted. It feels like a lot of the script has gone out the window. I mean, obviously October 7th was a horrible, unspeakable tragedy for the Jewish people. And in the ensuing war, it's been so much suffering and so much pain and so many innocent people involved, and continued ongoing suffering with the hostages and so on, and now here in the United States. So what are you thinking in terms of, do we give up that notion that life will be going back to normal? How do we settle into this in a way without losing our agency, as you said?
So I've realized that I think until the pandemic, I thought that things like epidemics, pandemics, loss of democracy, pogroms, were things that belonged in history books. I knew them as history. I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. And, you know, as a youngster, I wondered, a lot of my friends had parents who were survivors, and some of our teachers were survivors. I was like, why don't I belong to this club as a Syrian Jew? I didn't quite get it. But it was always at a remove. And then suddenly it's our lives. And I realized, like, I thought I was immune from history. I thought that. And that is so entitled, and it's so wrong. It's so deeply, deeply wrong. Here we are. Everything, so much of what we've cherished. Safety, Jewish safety in Israel. Our own democracy. Democracy in Israel has also been threatened in all kinds of ways. We can't take any of it for granted, right? So it feels like our fundamental set of assumptions have shifted and have left us profoundly disoriented, which is exactly where we should be. We are profoundly disoriented. And yet, I'm trying to like hang on to some normalcy. Like, I often at the end of the day is like, I can't take in another thing. What do? Turn on Seinfeld from the 90s. I want to pretend we're in the last century, right? It's before September 11th. It's before all of this. So I struggle between knowing and not wanting to know. Like, I really struggle. But I do think our responsibility is to understand the age we're in, and that we're not entitled to whatever we think is normal. It's not our entitlement. It's not anybody's entitlement.
So you feel like that one of the things that's happening now, and I agree with you, I just want to tease it out, like one of the things that we do psychologically as human beings is that to the extent that we have a preconceived idea of what a given moment should be like, or a given life should be like, the shoulding of things, like,
Right.
It should be this way,
Right.
It should be that way.
Right.
Right? That is something that we have to shed often when we realize that we're doing it, because that inhibits our ability
to see what's in front of us.
To see what's present for us.
Exactly. Personally and collectively.
And collectively. But I also just want to name that the reason why we are aggrieved, or that even grief arises, is because there is a kind of intuitive sense of how things should be to some extent, right?
Yeah, we grew up on it.
Right, we can't...
being Jews in America since World War II until recently, incredible privilege.
Right. And when we say...
And safety.
Right, but when you say, or I say, or any spiritual leader says, the first stage here is to at least acknowledge what's really true here, not, let's just acknowledge that we're feeling disoriented. Let's begin from that place of disorientation. Let's begin from the place of being dislocated. Yeah. Right? When you're on a detour, you're like, oh, this is not familiar to me. I thought, isn't this the road? And all of a sudden, Waze reroutes you, the app Waze. Right. You're like, you've made the wrong turn, or Waze took you another way, and you're like, oh, I'm trusting God, spirit, universe, whatever it is, to take me. But at least acknowledge that you're on a detour, or that you're dislocated and you feel lost. Yeah. And that's the first stage to then being able to then address how to get where you need to go, right? But I do want to acknowledge, though, that there are some healthy expectations of what things should be like, in a way, because if we don't have that, then we can become complacent or inured to, you're like, oh, it's okay. It's okay if having that kind of husband or that kind of partner, right? There is a certain vision of how things should be that we have to both keep clearly in view, even as we acknowledge that we're not there, right? Am I making sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So there's some values and principles we need to hold up for how things should be. Right. But I guess I'm also talking about losing our comfort. That's not what should be. That's not what we can count on. What we need to fight for or fight against is the dehumanization of lots of different kinds of people at this moment. Right? That's what should be, is that people should be treated like human beings with dignity and respect and some safety net. But that's different than privilege and comfort and being safe from history in a way. I'm also reflecting on the fact that both of us
Yeah.
challenged our scripts pretty profoundly, didn't live with normalcy, and now losing normalcy on another level, which is the collective global level. It's a lot. Like
it is a lot.
I feel like I'm yearning for refuge, whatever that means.
Yeah. For some terra firma, like just somewhere where we can land.
Exactly.
And like something will stay the same for a couple minutes.
What's the firm ground?
Yeah, totally. But I love the antidote. One of the things that you do, which is a really great spiritual resource, is to find a way to laugh, and to find a way to actively and agentically invite in something positive or something, that lifts you up, and that is a spiritual stratagem. Like, we need those things, right? We, if we're doom scrolling all the time, or we can really deplete ourselves, right?
Sources of joy and of refuge.
Right, joy and refuge.
And there's refuge and there's denial. Like when I'm in front of Seinfeld, it's fine. Like
Totally.
I need it, right?
Yeah.
I need to shut down for an hour a day or a half an hour a day, whatever it is, and pretend none of this is happening. But I think refuge is different. I'm not sure what it means exactly, but I feel like I'm looking for it. Like in Psalm 90, it says God has been, right, refuge for Israel for generation after generation. I'm wondering what that means. Just planting that question.
Well, I want to come back to something
Yeah.
that was, that we spoke about earlier, about your own journey and the various detours, that there was that relationship, that yearning for meaning, that yearning for purpose, that yearning for the divine. And I taught this a couple of weeks ago before Passover. It was the name of a friend, Daniel Bonner, who had quoted a Hasidic teacher who had lived during the worst imaginable moment in Jewish history, which was during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. And he had said that leaving Egypt happened physically, right? And physical pain, physical suffering didn't finish with the exodus from Egypt. But what happened in the exodus from Egypt, according to this teacher, was that we were forever had imprinted on us the yearning for freedom. And that if you are in suffering, but you still yearn for the release from suffering, if you are in persecution, you still yearn for the release from oppression and from smallness, that itself is a kind of a little bit of redemption. It's something to always take refuge in. And so I
take refuge in the yearning, you're saying.
Yeah, take refuge in that part of us which wants to be free, that part of us that wants to be without suffering, that part of us that wants to live in a world where dignity is conferred on all human beings. And that even if externally we're not there yet, we take refuge in that part of us which still is alive to that and wants that, and that itself can become a resource for us. And I loved that, as long as that is alive in us. And I thought that was alive in you when you were a young woman who I can imagine felt like, okay, how am I going to find my way in a very narrow Jewish community and with such a big spirit? And your refuge was in your own soul, your own listening to what it was that you were called to do in the world. Do you know of any other young Syrian Jewish women who want to follow your path into the rabbinate?
I don't.
You don't? I wonder.
Well, there's Esther Azar, Rabbi Esther. She was the second woman to become a rabbi from the community. Yeah. But
I just want to say this.
But it took years for there to be a second. I was ordained in 1995.
Right, but I just want to say to our listeners and to those who hopefully will listen to this conversation and become familiar with your teaching and with your work and your trailblazing. But I just want to know that years ago there was an artist that was commissioned to put up in Sukkot, in the huts that we build in the Harvest Festival called Sukkot. It was customary to put up pictures of great rabbis and great leaders who are guests, as it were, because they're on the wall. And Sukkot is a holiday of hospitality. And so there was an artist that was commissioned to put up pictures of women, great women, leaders and trailblazers. And you were one of the images. And I remember we went out and I bought them, and we had them up in our sukkah for a number of years. You were working at Romemu, but I had up in my sukkah these amazing women who had been trailblazers, Golda Meir and some other, and you were there. and I kept thinking,
Golda Meir and Dianne Cohler-Esses.
But listen, I can't tell you how many people in our community, in the Romemu community, who see in you and your commitment and your brilliance and your trailblazing, like your willingness to be in Ivriya, to be someone who's on one side, the whole world can be on the other, that is tremendously inspirational, right? And I know for myself, having worked with you for 13 years, I can't think of anyone that I know who inspires the ability to live with tremendously unique scripts that are handed over and over again and still make meaning of them, and to find purpose and possibility. And that's you, Rabbi Dianne Cohler-Esses.
Well, you are the one who really created a refuge in New York City for lots of Jews and others who are looking for a place to belong. Lots of people who don't belong easily
That's true. So
come to Romemu and are affirmed as being part of a community.
That's a blessing. So I just want to, before we sign off, I just wanted to ask you just one last question before we go. And what's giving you hope these days? And what are you hoping for? What's your prayer to your source, to the divine?
I'm taking hope in people who find ways to resist authoritarian and evil forces. Here, other places in the world, Ukraine, Israel.
Gaza, those amazing uprising also in Gaza.
Yeah. I don't know why. I'm kind of speechless by the question. I think because I'm searching for sources of hope right now. I have an easy answer.
All right, so then it's my turn.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that for children who grow up in a world where they see many models of what it is to be themselves and to be leaders, I'm hoping for a world where when parents sit down with their unique child, that the parents are given a blessing of being able to affirm and support and to imagine new possibilities for our children. I'm really hoping that in our lifetime that we'll have a world that is more loving and more harmonious and more creative with its ability to solve conflict and solve problems. And I want to finish with a bracha, a blessing, that may your teaching of Torah, which you love so much, Jewish wisdom and Jewish texts, and your love for people, which is so evident by anyone who's ever been your student or a congregant, may all of those things shine brightly and continue to inform and support people in our community and beyond it. I think for all of your detours and your destinations, we are very thankful. Thank you, Rabbi Dianne.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Beautiful conversation.
So that's it, everybody, for Detours and Destinations. I want to thank our team, producer Efrat Bigger, editor Maya Geyer, music by Shimon Smith. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y and to Eden Sidney Foster. Until next time, I'm Rabbi David Ingber. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again on our next Detours and Destinations.